All right, guys, what's going on? This is Matt with Patriots Corner. Now, big surprise tonight. We have 48-year law enforcement officer Jim Diamond. Now, has expertise in use of force and also has plenty of tactical experience. Jim, what's going on?
Things are going very well, actually. Enjoying the cool weather in Florida, which is unusual at this point, but expecting high 80s or high 70s and low 80s by the weekend.
Let's hope so. You know, Florida's a magnificent state, and I was just there. They said it was cool, and I was just kind of confused as to how 65 degrees was cool, but I guess for Floridians, they're used to the 90-degree weather, which is awesome at the same time, though.
Indeed.
So, Jim, I am so happy to have you on the show tonight. We've been wanting to do this now for about a week and a half. I want to jump right into it. Not everybody has use of force and plenty of experience in tactical operations in their job description. That's got to start somewhere. How did you
Well,
get involved with this?
if I'm a second generation police officer, was raised on the department, but as far as the use of force goes, I began martial arts at a very early age of 8 and have been in it most of my life. So when I came on the police department in 1970, some of the people I had trained with in the past were on the department, and it became a natural evolution to teach use of force and defensive tactics. And subsequently, I reached a height or a position where I ran the program for 25 years and became the subject matter expert for the Tampa Police Department for that period of time.
Wow, so when you say mixed martial arts, what type of mixed martial arts are you referring to? Like Ishinru, Muay Thai, kickboxing, or more in depth?
Well, I started in judo
Okay.
when I was very young, and then later on moved into Okinawan karate, and then the Greek martial arts form Prakatan in my adult years.
Very cool. Are you familiar at all with Gracie Jiu Jitsu?
Yes, I am. I have not studied it per se, but I have worked out and trained with a number of people who are very adept at that particular style.
Wow, very cool. Small world. I have done. I was did boxing and Muay Thai in martial arts for about 5 years at a place called Alex Wilkie's Martial Arts Academy in Bridgewater, New Jersey. And Gracie, there was always guys who were coming in, who were training at Gracie at the same time. So, whenever I hear judo, I always think of Gracie.
Indeed.
Very cool though. So, getting involved in this, it has to take a special person to do it, and somebody who has the will to do it. I mean, I'm sure you're dealing with something new every day, but in not the terms of something new where you might get a new email. You're going after guys. You know what I mean? That's what I find remarkable about you law enforcement officers is that your job, you know, you guys don't know what you're going into. Whether it's going to be hot or wild. And was that all, something that you were just looking forward to?
Well, I found that very early on, having the background and the physical size that I had in the early years, I was pushed through the door first by some of the older officers. And as I progressed with experience in the department, I found that our styles and our techniques changed along with the threat received by the bad guys. Uh, in the 70s, it was all brute force, if you would. We carried lignum vitae nightsticks, and many agencies at that time carried SAPs and other impact weapons because they lacked the physical skill to do anything else. Tampa was a very progressive department, and we looked in all areas and brought in experts from across the country to try to get away from the brute force type of approach and more technique come alongs and suppression holds.
Okay, and steering clear of the brute force and going to suppression holds. What would the reasoning behind that switch up kind of be? To just add less chaos? Would that, I don't know if that's the right word, but I don't know if you know which direction I'm kind of going in the question.
Well, absolutely, and that's the leadership of the department and those of us in the use of force and DT program. We're trying to come up with techniques where we could gain control of an individual and of the scenario without using excessive force or without causing injury. Every time you injure an arrestee, you're looking at a liability issue. Even back 40 some odd years ago, it became a concern of ours. Liability issues in law enforcement progressed from car crashes and pursuits into use of force that cost the industry millions of dollars across the country. So we tried to get ahead of the curve and use come alongs and joint manipulations, pressure points, and other techniques that would allow us to obtain control with minimum injury to the arrestee.
Wow, and is that something that was really hard for some people to transition to? Because I mean, putting it in terms of what I've seen, on the news, and even with stuff with Hollywood, which I know is not often always factual, you could have a guy running at you with, a machete or trying to punch you and stuff. Is that still you're staying in the mindset of trying to go to the submission, or more so doing what you have to do now to protect yourself?
Well, the use of force and confrontations with law enforcement is a very dynamic scenario. What we tried to do was set up, if you would, a series of skills and a training program that would allow the officer to reach into their grab bag of technique and use it to meet the threat. We trained very hard on come-alongs and subject control techniques. At the same time, we worked on impact weapons and we used on lethal force. And the difference was to have the officer have the conditioning, the competency, and more importantly, the confidence in those skills to use the appropriate one at the time and not just blindly react.
I understand. And was that something that certain people had a tough time switching over to, or did you see more people were kind of comfortable, with doing that? I'm sure it was a tough transition either way, though. You know what I mean? Because you guys deal with so much.
It was an extremely difficult transition for the older, more experienced officers who had been trained in a different mindset and a different program. But I found that young people coming into the law enforcement academies, as opposed to the college campus type setting for law enforcement today, were able to come in as, if you would, uneducated civilians. And within the 16-week training program, we were able to teach them physical conditioning, physical technique, and they bought into it in a repetitive and basically a full contact scenario. So by the time the younger people came through the academies and went out the other side, they had bought into our program. It just took a little longer in the in-service with the older officers to transition to empty hand techniques as opposed to a nightstick or another impact weapon.
Now, Jim, stuff that's used today, is that still heavily being practiced as far as with the submission holds? Is that, often kind of a tactical type of way to, in a scenario, get the job done? Is that still heavily practiced within law enforcement?
No, unfortunately, it's not. The cost of training and the time away from the job, if you would, is extremely high. And it's been my observation traveling across the country that a lot of that time has been taken away from the physical skills, the boxing, wrestling, submission hold techniques, and put into, if you would, technology. Today, a lot of time is spent on non-lethal techniques, in particular the taser and OC or chemical sprays, with the thought process that if I use this tool, I don't have to come in physical contact with an individual. And as a result, my old school thinking is that frequently it's a whole lot less adversarial to reach out and grab somebody by the arm and put them in a come along than it would be to tase them. But the new breed of law enforcement officer is taught to use their tools and not their bodies.
Now, do you think that that was kind of a flip around a little bit? You know, like we look at the military and, you know, often they're saying they're making the new age soldier. And do you feel that, you know, during this time of the 80s and 90s when they were really showing the submission type of practicing in scenarios, now transitioning back to the use of tools, do you feel like it was kind of a flip around a little bit, like taking a step back?
I do. I think we had made some really good progress in countermeasures and physical empty hand techniques, and we were not hurting people. And the statistics showed that during that period of time. Today, with the reliance on tools, when tools don't work, i.e., if a taser is not deployed correctly or the individual pulls out a barb, we lack the skill to go in hand to hand, and we end up, in many cases, the officers accelerate or go to the next level of force, which unfortunately can result in injury.
I understand, and I like actually how you said that. You know, not looking to go to. I don't. If I could play back your words, what you just said, they were really inspirational too. You know, not being afraid to go to those submission holds as in comparison to the tools and how they might not work. And do you feel that you're happy that you learned the one way? Because I'm going to put it in like a style of like a slang term almost, that if you were in a hand-to-hand combat with an individual, you know, his size not mattering or his craziness not mattering, you were not afraid to go into that battle hand-to-hand. You were not afraid to go in and do those holes and hit those points without thinking you had to go to the use of a tool. Do you think more officers, you know, now having been trained on tools, are kind of getting nervous? That's, you know, and by the way, this is not a hit at law enforcement by all, you know, I'm a huge supporter. Do you think they kind of get nervous, you know, and instantly now think to go to the tools because that's what they've been trained on, you know, majority of the time at their boot camp?
I think unfortunately the industry set a lot of officers up for failure because the manufacturers of these various tools, whether it be pepper spray or the taser or the source or any other type of implement such as that, manufacturers come in and tell the administration of the law enforcement agencies that these tools are going to solve all of our issues and we're going to be able to maintain control on everybody without harm. And when they fail, you see in many of the videos, you'll see an officer who uses a tool and it doesn't work, and you can almost see the hesitancy and the anxiety level rise because they don't know what to do, because they haven't been trained, well, if this doesn't work, what now? And the one true thing I found in over 4 decades in this industry is not everything works on everybody every time. So you better be in condition, and you better be competent, and you better be confident enough to get hands-on and get down in the dirt.
Yeah, I mean, there's videos out there all over the internet where somebody's acting completely insane, and the officer will shoot them with the prong taser, and somehow they're not going down. They're like, you know, walking around like they're fine, like there's no issue. And then the next thing you know, it's in hand to hand. You know, but were you more so kind of trained, and then we'll move on to the next topic, but were you more so kind of trained to deal with this one-on-one even before you're going to backup, as opposed to nowadays where people are calling in support, which I don't see anything wrong with that. Calling in support to even take down one suspect who might be completely chaotic and crazy in a scenario.
Well, yes, we were trained, and I trained my officers to evaluate the scenario. And it was based on physical size and aggressiveness and skill level that you could observe. And certainly we never taught anybody to bite off more than they can chew, if you would. But at the same time, we tried to get them to go hands-on or empty hand techniques first and escalate along with the activity of the bad guy, if you would, so that we didn't immediately go to the taser. We reached in and tried to take control. And frequently, had that happen, you wouldn't have had to use the electric weapon. But now the first response is, if the person doesn't immediately submit, then you implement an electrical weapon or a chemical weapon. And if that doesn't work, now what? And that seems to be, across the industry, a real problem for the younger officers.
I understand. And, kind of jumping into the modern day as right now, I do want to talk a little bit about, the events that took place in Florida, the tragedies. But before that, I want to ask you, do you feel now that the events that have taken place previously could have been solved in a different manner? Because there's some, honestly, and I'm not a law enforcement officer, I know nothing about it, I'm only a supporter, but there's some events that I have my opinions on, and I have seen how they were taken care of, and, I will not lie. I do think that some of them were taken care of, accordingly, due to the circumstances. But then again, I know nothing about it. That's why I'm happy, I have you on the show tonight. Do you think that certain events could have been handled differently?
I have reviewed untold use of force incidents between law enforcement and the bad guys or the arrestee, and I have found a number of occasions, and particularly recently, where, in my view, the officers, because they were unskilled and, more importantly, afraid, that they overreacted. I have seen, without being specific, I've seen dozens of situations where the officers used way too much force out of fright and not knowing what to do specifically, as opposed to those that I trained in the past that could bend an arm or bend a joint or take control or even put somebody to sleep with a neck restraint, as opposed to clubbing them or doing some other violent act to take control. And frequently, the individual becomes injured, the officer exposes himself to injury, and then we have a liability issue on a use of force case.
I got you. Now, what's your reasoning as far as them being afraid? Because with all this stuff going on, and especially right now, with the constant bash from certain individuals on law enforcement officers, which I completely don't agree with, does that add to sense of fear? I mean, I'm sure there's people who feel that the world's against them, due to situations that others have reacted and handled differently than they might have.
I think the current attitude of law enforcement, we are under attack. I think that the type A personalities and the intelligence level of current law enforcement, there's no way that they could not be aware that law enforcement is a target, that there are groups and there are attitudes out there in certain areas of the communities that they police where they are less than human and they are targeted because of the color of their uniform and not because of who or what they are. And I think that there is a level of anxiety on behalf of a lot of young police officers that was not there when I was a young patrolman. Uh, I also think that because they don't get the full contact training in the academy that we used to teach, I think that they are taken aback when they're accosted with physical brutality and they overreact or they fail to react and become injured.
And why is that, do you think? Jim, being a 48-year-old law enforcement officer, having seen different generations of police officers in the new wave, why do you think they are under attack currently right now, other than, certain stuff that the media does put out there on Continuum?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with as I said earlier in the interview, was the lack of training time and the expense of training having gone up. They're given very little opportunity to practice the skills they need. And if you don't practice, and you recall from your own Muay Thai and other things, if you don't practice and you walk into an engagement with somebody who has, you immediately feel anxious and feel at a disadvantage.
Absolutely.
I think a lot of officers feel that in a physical encounter right now because they don't have the training to back them up.
Absolutely. And it leading into the next and then to the next. So, yes, I understand your answer. Going up to the tragedy that took place in Florida, I did see you did give an interview on a news station in regards to that, which is honestly why I want to have you on the show, because I loved your interview and I enjoyed listening to your response. Do you feel? Well, I'll just ask. What was your opinion on everything that did take place there at the school shooting?
Well, originally in the previous interview, I was asked, was it appropriate for the sheriff to blame the deputy as being solely responsible for that tragedy? And my comment to then and still is that barring a proof or video of a cowardly act or a refusal to act, that we should give the benefit of the doubt to that particular deputy. Of course, after that interview, some information has come out that may lead to a question of cowardice or backbone. But the bottom line is that after Columbine, we started training differently, or attempting to, and that was to, rather than wait the time period for SWAT and tactical units to get there, to get a backup when the first or the second officer shows up to assist you, go to the sound of gunfire or go to the site of the trouble. Individuals under fire, whether they're in the military or whether they're in law enforcement, never know how they're going to respond until that first round comes by your head. Some respond heroically, some freeze, and some unfortunately run the other way. My concern about what happened in the school shooting in Florida was that a middle-aged deputy who appeared to lack training and physical conditioning did not react appropriately and gave conflicting information, as it appears. But even that, I did not feel that he was solely responsible. And subsequently, information has come out where other officers took cover. On-scene commanders gave conflicting information about whether they should go in or should not go in. There was an entire systemic failure, in my opinion, from the federal engagement with this individual beforehand to the sheriff's office, multiple contacts with this individual, and, of course, the actual day of the tragedy. There were any number of officers who failed to act appropriately. And I think it's tragic. It's a shame when any person that we're sworn to protect loses their life because we didn't do what we could have done or should have done. But it's also a learning process, and I think that nationally, as it happened after Columbine with Klebold and Harris that I think we will learn from it as an industry, and I doubt seriously that that type of scenario will happen again. In fact, the shooting that just occurred in Massachusetts, where the individual shot 2 students, you notice that SRO immediately went to the sound of the gunfire and engaged the subject. But again, no one knows how they're going to react until that particular crisis point. And some and most in my industry respond appropriately.
I hear you, yeah, and I agree. And, when I saw everything kind of play out with that, and then it was, directed towards the deputy, I was kind of confused, about everything, about which way I should think, and, the thoughts that were going through my head, because there was, I will not lie, a little on both sides. It did start, I agree with you, though. I agree with your statement that you made, and personally, I really started to feel that as this one kind of dig at him continued on, and, on this, having to do with this horrible tragedy, it just seems like everything shifted. They shifted. This kid might now sit, in a penitentiary. I don't know what's going to happen to him. I can't even look at his face. But it has shifted now. It shifted to the deputy and everything. The magnifying glass was focused in on him. And that's where I got extra confused, because it just kind of seemed like that sheriff really kind of supported the statements, which I really have to, I don't agree with. Do you feel like he had his back turned on him?
I think that he was held up by the Sheriff Israel, as the person responsible. And I think that the sheriff's statement that I train them and I equip them, if they don't choose to do it, that's not my responsibility, that's theirs. I find that a deplorable statement. And I think that irrespective of whether this particular deputy acted as he should have, or he acted, and that's still up in question, whether or not he acted based on previous training or a misunderstanding of the tactical scenario. If he wasn't a tactically trained officer, he might have misperceived how the rounds were coming in or the noise he was hearing, where it was coming from. But irrespective, whether he acted appropriately or not, for the leader of that agency to say, these people died because this man and this man alone did not act, and I'm cutting him loose, that is nothing but scapegoating.
Absolutely, I agree with you.
A real leader would have, albeit suspended that officer, conducted an investigation, and if he could have proved that the officer or the deputy acted in a cowardly manner, then he would have dismissed him. But it may very well be that an investigation showed that there was confusion, that he misperceived what was going on, or he was just plain frightened and didn't know what the heck to do. That doesn't necessarily make him responsible for the entire event. And that's what Sheriff Israel was trying to do. He was trying to deflect blame from himself as the leader of that organization.
I agree with you. And do you kind of see where I'm going with how everything seemed to kind of shift? It shifted off of the killer. It still was focused in on him, as to the horrible, horrendous things he did. But it shifted, on this guy. Now he's going to get blamed for this whole thing. That's a concern. That's a red flag. You could seriously, mentally disturb an individual with putting that falsifying information and statements in his head.
Well, I think that's the problem, and I would be, from a professional standpoint, I would be very concerned for that deputy's mental state going down the road. They're calling him all kinds of names, and as I said, if he acted inappropriately, or in fact, if he acted cowardly, he has to live with that, and there is liability that goes with that. But to publicly announce by the leader of your organization that he's the responsible party, I think that was extremely, number one, premature, and number two, that's not good leadership. And in fact, that's atrocious leadership.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it's kind of hypocritical too. Not that I want to get too political, but it's wasn't Sheriff Israel the one? I don't know. I might be all wet on this. I don't know if you know. Wasn't he the one who apparently was extremely close with Hillary Clinton? I'm not a fan. I don't know if you are. I'm sorry for my statement here. If you are, I'm not a fan of hers. I think she's a horrible person. But I'm pretty positive he was the one who was close, if not close. Was very supportive to her. We look at Benghazi. I've had John Tegan on the show as well, and he mentioned everything about where all of that stuff went wrong. We're talking about somebody who was there, and then it just kind of seems a bit hypocritical to me.
Well, I think I don't know what his relationship is with Mrs. Clinton, but I do know that the behavior that he portrayed in my mind was very similar to what she did when she said, "What difference does it make at this point in time?" It's deflection. It's an attempt to avoid responsibility for a lack of leadership and a lack of decision making at the time. And as I said earlier, I'm concerned about the mental well-being of that deputy. Whether he acted appropriately or inappropriately, he doesn't deserve that kind of treatment. He is a human being after all, even if he is a flawed one. And secondarily, the system failed those kids, not just one individual. Like I said, the on-scene commander told them not to go in. Nobody should have given the order not to go in. Everybody who got there should have gone in at the point that they got there. So it's a difficult scenario.
I've noticed, and that's something, my next question is, everybody wants to know the answers, and in my opinion, it's a harder answer to give, I think, than really anything, especially dealing with innocent children in a school shooting leading to a massacre. How do we get rid of this?
Well, I think they need to review in the cold light of day the entire scenario and take the emotion out of the loss of those children and the teachers. From my point of view, and trying not to be political, but just as a professional observer, we need to look at why the FBI failed to follow the IP address of the individual that was offered up to them early. We need to find out what system exists for why the sheriff's office didn't Baker Act this young man on the 45 plus times that they encountered him, and he demonstrated or was alleged to have demonstrated violent behavior or violent threats against his mother. We need to know why the communications, the 911 system, went to the smaller adjoining city and not to the sheriff's office. That's another issue that is contributing to this, that the small police department, the officers there, had firsthand information from the 911 calls, and they entered the building first because they had the communication. Where the sheriff's office, it was being filtered, if you would, or diluted. The entire scenario needs to be looked at, just like we looked at Columbine. It needs to be broken down step by step. After action reports need to be absolutely blatantly honest, and those who are at fault need to be corrected, and the training program needs to be consistent with two officers. The first officer has the option. The second officer, most definitely, we go 2 by 2. And we do that for a purpose that we can't afford to lose. We don't gamble 1 for 1. Law enforcement must win. So at the moment you think you have a tactical advantage, whether it's an individual or multiple officers, that you think you have the tactical advantage, you go and you interdict the problem. And the only way to do that is to totally critique that scenario and correct everything that was wrong going forward.
And that's something that I wanted to bring up real quick as well is how you kind of said with the federal. I mean, this is something that the disturbing stuff that this kid was putting out there for months, is stuff that my parents and I know friends of mine's parents raised them never ever to put, never to have that thought, one. Two, if you do got that wild, nutty thought, because to me, it's a nutty thought and crazy, why are you putting it out there? I mean, you got to think, like, people are always saying that Big Brother's watching you. So you got criminals who are not going to post, for example, a drug location of where let's say the crack house is at, on a certain site, thinking that maybe somebody's going to get a tip and somebody's going to go after that individual. That's what kind of puzzles me as to why nothing was ever taken place. Is there really maybe not as much security, enforced and monitoring as we think there might be?
Well, I don't think the moderators, if you would, of these social sites, they're, number one, they're not law enforcement. Number two, they are subject to their own prejudices and their own opinions. So they pick and choose. Unfortunately, there is no definitive standard. And secondarily, it's not just the social media. If the school themselves...
Well, I'm sorry, Jim, I should phrase the question. I'm sorry to interrupt. Better like law enforcement. I know that law enforcement and federal, especially federal, I know they have the ability to go online in the internet, at least I'm almost positive they do, and check to see what certain people are doing. And what sites are out there and what's being commented. That's primarily how I know a lot of them are getting these people who are signing up for ISIS and going over to the Middle East to fight, for ISIS and stuff like that, all that kind of crazy crap.
Well, it's relatively easy, and it's certainly common knowledge that there are algorithms and programs that pick up keywords, and immediately there's flags and bells going off, so we can identify those types of conversations. And you're right, that's how the FBI is able to interdict, in many cases, of these people who are potential terrorists who are becoming radicalized. What amazes me is that if they had done a complete search of this individual's conversations through social media and whatnot, they would have been picking up those phrases, those keys that would have given them clue that this guy had some type of hostile intent towards the school. And apparently the ball was dropped at that level as well, where they basically just poo-pooed it and said, oh, it's a big nothing, And they said, well, we couldn't track his name down. Well, his name was exactly the way it is. I mean, I'm certainly there's a whole lot of cruises in this world, but the IP address would have taken them right back to him. So there was a lack of, if you would, dedication and a lack of hard work, if you would, on all levels in this particular incident.
Now, Jim, I do want to ask you one more question. What do you think the main concern is now that this second and third battle that we're fighting now as a country after this tragedy did take place? Is this a mental health problem or is it a gun problem to you?
This is most definitely a mental health problem. I've looked into all of these. I interviewed the SROs at Columbine years ago. I've done my own research on workplace violence and reviewed all of these things with everything that I can get my hands on. And in each and every time there's one of these actions, there are precursors, there are activities, there are statements, there are means of behavior that are demonstrated by these perpetrators before the act that nobody picks up. Our problem today is, number one, mental health issues in this country are ignored. We have a conflict with HIPAA laws and what people think they can say about an individual who is acting bizarrely. They're concerned about those types of issues, so they don't write things down. It might be a violation of the individual's rights. People are afraid to get involved, and the see something, say something only works so far. Most people today, even today, don't want to get involved.
Yeah.
But when you have a behavior that is so bizarre as in this particular case, the school recognized it. They told him he couldn't come on the property with a backpack. Common sense would indicate to you that the reason they want him coming on the school property with a backpack is because they were afraid he would bring a weapon of some kind and use it. And yet nobody pulled the pin and hoisted him up to law enforcement as an issue.
Sure.
So mental health issues need to be addressed. They need to be mental health behavior, overt actions that are bizarre and out of the norm need to be referred to medical authorities for review. And that type of continued behavior needs to be in part of the background checks on people buying weapons, getting passports, doing all kinds of things. But if you've got a person who is that bizarre that he threatens to kill his mother repeatedly, he should not have been allowed to buy that weapon at 18 years old.
Absolutely not.
Not that any other 18-year-old couldn't do that, but that individual with those mental health problems should have been flagged, and it should not have happened.
Yeah. And it's this ongoing thing with babying. You know, I mean, not even in that regard, but with the fact of you have a lot of people coming out and attacking, whether it be law enforcement or maybe a psychiatrist or anybody with some type of protective stance in these types of situations. You know, we're not talking about walking through a garden, you know, and just you know, patting somebody on the back. This is like life-threatening stuff that we're talking about where, you know, here so many innocent children were killed, you know, by the hands of this kid. And now it seems like, you know, almost all the time somebody's got something to say, you know, like it's as if it's a cover-up. It doesn't mean that everything went away. It means that it needs to get addressed, but this kid still shot and killed those kids. So he, in my opinion, you know, he's to blame. I mean, he did the act. It was horrible. And you're absolutely right when you say about the disturbing thoughts that he had towards his own mother, you know, is just, it's horrendous. You know, you see people growing up in bad environments and in bad homes. They don't, you know, not all of them go and do that. Some of them go out and they grind out and they play, you know, either a professional sport, they go into acting, you know, they go into law enforcement like yourself, the military, they try to change themselves. And I just don't get why people are constantly trying to find a way to lash out at the guy who might have a stern face because he knows that this is no, excuse my language, but bullshit type of deal. You know, there's people's lives who are at stake.
I think that we have a tendency not to want to get involved, and we've become a permissive society that's afraid to judge. And oh my gosh, don't you judge. I mean, we even offered gym memberships because everybody judges but us. We don't judge. Well, I'm sorry. That type of behavior on the part of Mr. Cruz should have been enough for me and for everybody else who came in contact with him to say, this kid has a problem, he needs help, and he needs to be examined.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Jim, I want to thank you so much for joining me on the show tonight. It was an honor to have you on. Fantastic interview. Thank you for your service, by the way. I love the interview. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you, Matt. I enjoyed it for myself.
Sheriff, thank you so much, and God bless, and stay strong, and you know, keep doing what you're doing. You're an incredible man, very intelligent, and I thank you so much.
Thank you, Matt. Have a good evening.
You too, sir.